All right, welcome everyone for another week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. I'll be very brief. I think everyone here has had a chance to either read or see some of the work in audio form by Larry Freeman. He has already delivered several amazing presentations on history with a focus on Africa in the past to our foundation. I'm going to have a couple of those links in the description box below. Today, Larry Freeman has been wonderfully accommodating and has agreed to present on a topic that is very important, because right now the world desperately needs to come out with a commitment to accepting one new system, which will be the foundation upon which the coming generations live, build, grow together in either harmony or at war with each other. Obviously, there's a fight between these two systems are incompatible. If anyone has been following here, my writings or the work of Cynthia for the past months and years. Obviously, the Greater Eurasian Partnership, the Multipolar Alliance, is the only system that has viability, that can actually float, that has principles that it operates on that are in accord with natural law. The other system, unfortunately, the one that most of us happen to be living within here in the transatlantic community, is premised around certain ideas that are completely in defiance of natural law, and that are premised on certain dysfunctional ways of thinking about the nature of man, the nature of creation, which cannot long endure. So we're really, really advocating here that nations accept their destiny to be a species premised around cooperation, win-win development, and principles that don't put the value on worshiping money or simply reducing carbon footprints, but rather put the value on increasing the quality of life of all human beings, regardless of what religion or culture we happen to be in. We are all human beings. So Africa is a key battle zone right now over the moral fitness, whether humanity has the moral fitness to survive or not. There's two different destinies pulling on Africa. And had we gone with the decisions and the vision of people like Franklin Roosevelt, which has almost been scrubbed from history books, the last 80 years would be very different. And it's an interesting irony that the nation or nations of the world that are currently reawakening the spirit of what FDR died defending are not they're not technically American, but this is something I'm thinking we're going to be able to learn about today. So today's presentation is called Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a US president committed to the development of humankind. Larry, you can take as much time as you want. Like usual, we're gonna have a Q&A, and everybody just simply put your name in the Q&A or in the chat box, and I'll call upon you in queue, and you can pose questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, and the Rising Tide Foundation for giving me this platform for discussion. I will be concentrating today on two of the accomplishments of Franklin Roosevelt. One is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, and the other is Bretton Woods itself. And what I want to focus on is the principles of these two accomplishments of Roosevelt, which reflect his own thinking. I come to this presentation, as Matt has alluded, I've been involved, I guess people call me an African specialist. I've been involved in Africa at increasing levels of development, of time commitment and activity for about 35 years. So I bring a knowledge of physical economy to Africa as a student of Alexander Hamilton and the American political economy. But I also then have a unique understanding of the African continent. And I understand that until African nations become economically sovereign and develop, and particularly have industrial development and manufacturing sectors, they will not be free from economic manipulation, might call it economic strangulation. So my outlook is I'm distinguished from 99% of all other Africanists in the United States and Europe, and also many Africans as well don't share my point of view. But to achieve economic progress in Africa, which is part of the subject of this discussion, one has to understand the importance of credit, not money, but credit. And Roosevelt applied the Hamiltonian concept of credit for his policies in the United States and internationally. And I've been trying to educate my African friends on this concept of credit. And actually, I've been in a project for the last year or two to create an Africa Infrastructure Development Bank, standing on the shoulders of Hamilton and Roosevelt in particular. There have been other presentations on this platform on Roosevelt, and in fact, one was written, I guess, several weeks ago, which on commemorating Roosevelt's death, citing from As He Saw It, which is one of the primary books. But there are several others that have to be brought into the discussion. And my hope is that I will augment our understanding and philosophy of Roosevelt in this brief presentation. And maybe there'll be a part two, which will discuss Roosevelt's fight against the British Empire. Let me say, first of all, from a historical standpoint, there have been four principal applications of Hamilton's national banking concept. There was the first national bank, which he designed from 1791 to 1811. There was the second national bank from, I believe, 1816 to 1836, which included the years of the presidency of John Quincy Adams, who used the bank for massive expansion and economic growth in the United States. The third was Abraham Lincoln in 1862, created the Greenbacks, and in 1863 actually passed a National Banking Act. And the fourth, which we'll discuss today, was from 1932 to actually as far as 1957, Franklin Roosevelt created a new vehicle for credit called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC. Actually, he didn't actually create it, he transformed it. But we're going to look at the specific measures that FDR used with the RFC and how those same principles and policy and outlook by Roosevelt was used in his intention for the creation of the Bretton Woods. And what is the mindset that Roosevelt had behind both of these is very clear from just following the application of his policies. I mean, what the Franklin Roosevelt accomplished with the RFC in 12 years of his presidency was nothing short of phenomenal. We can't go through all the accomplishments of the New Deal. That's way too many for us, but we're going to concentrate on the principles behind what in the chief institutions of the New Deal, which was the RFC. Just a little bit of history on Roosevelt. He was born January 30th, 1882. That's significant because it's less than one generation since the Civil War period, which was a great development period under Abraham Lincoln. We had the Civil War, but it also was the same period in which Abraham Lincoln launched the East-West Railroad. And basically Lincoln applied the American system and carried out also a victory against the South, who were intent on destroying our nation. So that's a very important cultural period that Roosevelt is sort of born into in 1880s. But the 1882 is also a period in which the Jim Crow laws are being expanded in the United States. So there's a conflicting generation for him in growing up in the United States. His great-great-grandfather was Isaac Roosevelt, known as Isaac the Patriot. He was a member of the Federalist Party, a close collaborator of Alexander Hamilton. Roosevelt wrote about Hamilton briefly, but when he was infected with polio, he then used part of that period in addition to trying to develop himself physically, he mentally used this period for also reviewing Hamilton's work. As a senior undergraduate at Harvard in 1903, he wrote a short paper, I think about a dozen pages, on his senior thesis was on Alexander Hamilton. And I'm just going to quote one paragraph because it shows that Roosevelt understood the Hamiltonian perspective. Quote, Washington, the first president under the Constitution, made Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury the greatest of the cabinet offices. As Hamilton had stabilized the problem of state, so now he ordered the finances of the country. And it was his impetus that the removal for all time the risk of disintegration of the states, end of quote. And Roosevelt in his paper also goes on to the importance of Hamilton joining in the defeat of Aaron Burr for president against Thomas Jefferson, because this would have set up this would have prevented the development of the United States. If Burr had won, we would have seen the establishment of a Northern Confederacy and a division of the United States. Briefly, Roosevelt's family arrives in about 1650. Nicholas Roosevelt had two sons, Jacobus, who established the Hyde Park Roosevelts of New York State, from which Franklin Roosevelt came from, and his brother Johannes, who gave birth to the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, which is where Teddy Roosevelt came from, and that's the pro-slavery branch of the family. Even though Teddy and FDR were fifth cousins, their policies were dramatically different. Also, FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a niece of Teddy Roosevelt, and she also rejected their pro-slavery, pro-British outlook. Now, what's important to understand in everything that Roosevelt did from the day he came into office on March 4th, 1933, is he was guided by a principle. And the principle that guided the RFC and guided Bretton Woods and all of his actions for his 12 years in office was the general welfare, which was cherished by FDR and is enshrined in the eloquently poetic preamble of the US Constitution, which I think it's important to read. Quote, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. I might add here that many people in the various debates that are going on, including the debate over the right to bear arms and other debates in the United States, misunderstand the Constitution. They think the Bill of Rights provides them their essential freedoms and is the guiding outlook for the United States. And the Bill of Rights is at best secondary to the actual preamble. The preamble is probably the most precious gift given to the United States and really given to the rest of the world if they would read it and understand it. Roosevelt's foreign policy was guided by the general welfare principle as well as his domestic policy. He developed from this what he called his good neighbor policy, which was an orientation to Latin America primarily, but it also extended to Europe and it also extended to Africa. It was his commitment to the principle of general welfare and the good neighbor policy that guided him to find ways to collaborate with other powers around the world, such as China and Russia, which unfortunately our present Western leadership and now the United States is demonizing and threatening today. But that was not the outlook that Roosevelt had. Roosevelt's practical application of the general welfare principle will be discussed in this presentation And already we see clearly in his inaugural address on March 4th, 1933, how he was going to apply this principle to the conditions of the Great Depression in the United States. And I want to quote a few paragraphs from this, but it's worthwhile for everybody to read. I mean, among other things that Roosevelt wrote, the first inaugural address is quite something. And just to read a couple of sections from it, quote, "Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of a war, but at the same time, through this employment, accomplishing greatly needed projects to stimulate and reorganize the use for natural resources. Finally, in our progress towards the resumption of work, we require two safeguards against a return to the evil of the old order. There must be a direct supervision of all banking credits and investments so that we can put an end to speculation with other people's money. And there must be a provision for an adequate but sound currency. In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to a policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself because he respects the rights of others, the neighbor who respects his obligations and respects the sanctity of his agreements in and with a world of neighbors." That's a pretty broad conception, but both he addresses in his inaugural address in 33, both what he plans to do domestically and the base of his foreign policy. We're not going to go into the good neighbor policy for Ibero-America. He did propose a Ibero-American Development Bank, and was defeated in the Congress, but he developed a very strong relationship, especially with Brazil and other countries. And this bank has many of the same principles he applied to his foreign policy later on. Now, Roosevelt, most people, well, we used to know in the schools the great accomplishments of the first 100 days of Roosevelt. In fact, they're quoted all the time, the 100 days, what is the 100 days going to be? And I guess every Democrat like Biden and Obama and Clinton, they all talk about the first 100 days. And there was a lot accomplished in the first 100 days. He takes office on March 4th. On March 5th, the day after inauguration, he proclaimed the bank holiday. On March 9th, he had the Emergency Banking Act, which he presented to Congress. On March 29th, the Securities Act of 1933. On March 31st, the establishment of the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. On March 9th, he took the dollar off gold. On March 12th, the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act, which included the Agricultural Adjustment Act. On May 12th, the Federal Emergency Relief Act. On May 18th, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act. Also on May 18th, the Glass-Steagall Act. On June 3rd, the Homeowners Loan Act. And on June 16th, the National Industrial Recovery Act. So that's approximately 100 days since he got into office. All these initiatives were invaluable and helped lift the nation out of the Depression and actually established policies that have served us for many decades, including up to today. Federal Reserve, of course, that's not the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Social Security, etc. But the Reconstruction Finance Corporation is possibly the single most important effort that Roosevelt had, because I believe without that, none of the rest of his initiatives, domestic and foreign, would have been accomplished. The RFC was a unique Hamiltonian credit machine that restored the United States from the Great Depression and save the world from succumbing to Nazi fascism. Now, the RFC existed before Roosevelt took office, but he transformed it according to the principles of the general welfare. Remember, the previous president from 29 to 32 was Herbert Hoover. And following the stock market collapse of 1929, the US entered into a deep depression, as that's well known. Between 1929 and 1930, investment collapsed by 35%. Banks defaulted on several 100,000 depositors. Overnight, New York City had 82 bread lines, serving 85,000 meals per day. And President Hoover wanted to believe that that government intervention was not necessary and that the depression would be over soon. That is what he kept telling himself, and that is what he told the American people. Now, one thing he did on the advice of the various financial monetarists around him is he created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation on January 22nd, 1932, and it became operational 1 month later. And he had his Federal Reserve chairman was Eugene Meyer, a financier, a political insider, and a publisher of the Washington Post. Hoover made him chairman of the RFC, but he also appointed a group of Democrats and Republicans to the board. And on the board was appointed Jesse Jones. So he was a board member of Hoover's original RFC. The problem was that Hoover's RFC was never going to change anything. And he authorized, the RFC under Hoover was authorized to lend money to financial institutions, primarily railroads, which were one of the largest financial institutions in the country then, small banks, and some large banks. The RFC gave a loan of $65 million to the Bank of America. The idea that Hoover had under the monetarist philosophy, I should say ideology, was that the banks, if they were propped up and they were provided with liquidity, then these institutions would lend money and we could end the depression. This never happened. And the Hoover's RFC was a complete failure. Now it's interesting that the RFC was created by what? It was created by debt, as many institutions that we use. There was a $500 million purchase from the Treasury of RFC stock. And it was authorized to borrow another $1.5 billion through the sale of bonds to the Treasury. So therefore, it was able to issue its own credit based on its stock and borrowing, which was itself a form of credit. So credit has never been a problem. And the RFC had to be reauthorized periodically, and new spending disbursements also had to be authorized. But the problem was during the course of 1932, the RFC just lent money, a large portion to small banks, but this was not changing the economy. In fact, what these banks did with the money is they would pay the loans they owed to the larger banks. So there was liquidity in the banking system, but like the previous period we've been through, there was no lending. So the banks had liquidity, there was increase in dividends to some of the bank shareholders, but the depression got worse and worse. And I want to quote from one of the books that I think I use for this, if people are interested, is from a fellow named author Steven Feinberg. He wrote a book recently, Unprecedented Power, Jesse Jones, Capitalism and the Common Good. So here's what Feinberg had to say about this period of the Hoover RFC. Quote, the cold, wintry months between Franklin Roosevelt's November 1932 election and his March 1933 inauguration were among the most painful and harsh of the Great Depression. From 1929 to the start of 1933, national income shrunk by half. The stock market prices fell 75%. Wheat sold for 30 cents a bushel, down from $3. Home foreclosures surged from a normal 78,000 annually to 273,000. And by the end of 1932, 20% of the nation's children did not have enough to eat. During 1932, more than 3 times as many people left the United States as immigrated. That's a fairly good summary of conditions in 1932. Roosevelt comes into office with these are the conditions in the country. And he, as the elected leader of our nation, has to solve it. And that what happened is he began the long process of turning the Depression around. How did he do it? On March 9th, which is 5 days after he takes office, he has Congress pass his Emergency Banking Act in a mere 7 hours. Imagine that today. Now, what's interesting about the Banking Act, which should be highlighted, is Title III of the EBA, Emergency Banking Act, authorized the RFC to make purchases of preferred stock in banks, trust companies, and other financial institutions. These were no longer loans. This was now the government intervening in the form of ownership into the economy, exactly what Hoover refused to do and what Hoover's monetarist advisors told him not to do. So right here, Roosevelt begins a very significant change in authorization of buying preferred stock and moving away from simple loans. And this was done consciously by Roosevelt based on the general welfare principle to intervene. He was going to intervene to restructure, reconstruct, and expand an economy that was killing and causing great hardship for American citizens. He was going to do something about it. Now, 1 month later, in May of 1933, FDR appoints Jesse Jones, a well-known banker and businessman from Texas, to be the chairman of the RFC. The like-mindedness of Jones and FDR began the process with the new authority of the RFC, began the process of transforming the United States and the world for the next 12 years that Roosevelt was in office. The RFC did linger on afterwards, but it's the 12 years from Roosevelt's RFC to his death in 1945 that we see the great transformation. And this agreement in ideas and principle between Jesse Jones and President Roosevelt literally, not figuratively, but literally saved the United States and saved the world. And this is what we have to understand. This was not some bill here or bill there. This was a conception that Roosevelt knew from Hamilton and others, and he was applying it. They knew that reversing, both Jones and FDR knew that reversing depression, they needed to get credit into the economy. Credit to help business, credit to help people, credit to alleviate the suffering of the population. They were both acting on the principle of the general welfare for the common good, and for the United States and for the world. The problem is the banks didn't want to lend money. Sound familiar? They were using the loans to build up their liquidity and pay dividends, but they wouldn't lend money for the expansion of the economy. I think we've seen that since 2008. But Jones and Roosevelt had a different idea. Here's what Jones had to say. The manufacturer, the processor, the merchant, the employer must all have additional capital and additional credit if they are able to carry out the recovery program. Banks must exert themselves to meet the situation by lending credit. Credit is the bloodstream of all business, and banking is the heart. Banks that accept deposits but do not extend credit in a reasonable way will not contribute to the general health and economic welfare nor to a business recovery. So he was getting increasingly, since he took office, Jones was getting more and more blunt about the problems with the banking system. And we see time and time again that both of them, Roosevelt and Jones, understood the role of credit and understood the responsibility of government to intervene for the people. And Jones kept telling the banking community, you should be lending money, but if you don't lend credit to the economy, then the United States government will be the lender of last resort. And this is what the RFC became. On an unprecedented scale, it became an institution of credit to promote the general welfare. Jones told a group of bankers in 1934, his second year as the RFC chairman, if the bankers failed to grasp this opportunity, his opportunity, and meet his responsibility, there can be one alternative: government lending. The question therefore follows: will our banking be continued in private hands, or of necessity be supplanted by the government? The answer is with you, the banker. He went on to say, no one must be allowed to suffer for lack of food, clothing, or shelter, or become a mendicant for the lack of credit for agriculture, business, and industry, small as well as large. Banking should be conducted in the spirit of public service, other than that purely for profit. It should be more a profession than a business involved with speculation. Now, of course, this is where many people like to say that Roosevelt was a socialist, but actually none of this is true, because at the end of the RFC, everything they created by the government was sold or given back to the private sector. And in fact, RFC never lost any money because the loans that it made produced a repayment of the loans. So there was no giveaways and there was no ownership by the government. There was a credit system mechanism that was necessary to turn the country around economically, and then several years later became the engine for the victory in the war. Now, Roosevelt's next expansion, this first expansion of the RFC, was to allow it to buy preferred stock, that had become an owner in some of these financial institutions, but that was limited. So on June 24th, 1934, which is now more than a year after Roosevelt was taken office, he makes the next expansion. He authorizes the RFC to make direct interventions to business, industry, and eventually into states and individual consumers. But now they could intervene into business and industry, not just the financial sector. And as you can see, in each year, Roosevelt continues to expand the credit lending authority, RFC. As I say, I think it started off at about we'll get to about 1.5 billion, but then it was expanded up to, by the end, had disbursement authorization, probably close to 50 billion. The RFC not only assisted the banks, but also mortgage and construction loans through Fannie Mae. It funded the Federal Housing Administration. It funded the Export-Import Bank, the Commodity Credit Corporation, the Public Works Administration. It bought gold on the market to raise the price under instructions from Roosevelt. The RFC lent money to small entrepreneurs. Even one case of lending $22 to a barbershop owner to buy tools for his trade. And it ended up lending more to outside of defense, which was the key aspect of World War II. Farmers got the greatest investment of any particular section of the economy. And the RFC was lending more money than the entire American banking system. It dwarfed what JP Morgan was lending because it was committed by Roosevelt to the general welfare. Just take one example. Look at the Rural Electrification Administration, REA. At the beginning of the Depression, only 20% of rural households and farms had access to electricity, 20%. Within a few years, several years, 90% of these same farms and households had power. This came about because of the RFC lent the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, $40 million per year for 10 years at 3% interest. And that electrified, if you will, brought electricity to the rural section of the United States. Obviously, this can be done, this principle can be applied to any country in any part of the world. And this kind of credit extension intervention could be applied to Africa, where you have over 600 million people, almost half the population, with no access to electricity. These principles can be applied, and that's what I've been working on for many years. And as I said, the RFC didn't lose money. So the Rural Electrification Administration is just one example of how Roosevelt transformed a major problem for the country and completely reversed it. So the principle always remains the same. And this is what Jones understood, and this is what Roosevelt understood. Now, Roosevelt, in my opinion, because I've been reading about him for about the last 25 years, I'm thinking no later than 1936, expected that the United States would enter the war. But he had to do it in stages because the United States population didn't want to enter the war. But he was already thinking about it. He was thinking very early on about the possibility of war, and he was also thinking very early on about the post-war period. But the arsenal of democracy is a phrase I think everybody knows. The United States built the industry that helped win the war. But the arsenal of democracy, and I can tell you this absolutely, the arsenal of democracy would not have existed without their RFC. President Roosevelt delivered one of his famous fireside chats. People not familiar with this was an innovation that Roosevelt made. And people would sit by their radio every 2 weeks listening to these speeches by Roosevelt, which he was educating and informing the population. Now, you can actually go to one of the museums in Washington, I'm sure it's in other places, actually they have recordings in his voice of these chats, which is very inspiring. But let me read you from the May 26, 1940 fireside chat when he's discussing the war. Now, this is 1940, May, and we don't enter the war until December 1941 officially. I know that private business cannot be expected to make all of the capital investments required for the expansion of plants and factories and personnel, which this program calls for at once. Therefore, the government of the United States stands ready to advance necessary money to help provide for the enlargement of factories, establishment of new plants, the employment of thousands of necessary workers, the development of new sources of supply for hundreds of raw materials required, and the development of mass transportation of supplies. Now, all of that fell on the shoulders of Jesse Jones and the RFC. In June 1940, 1 month after this speech, by an act of Congress, the RFC was now got a new authorization of power to purchase, build, and lease plans for the upcoming war effort. That's May 1940. This was the largest involvement of the RFC in the economy, as we'll discuss in a few minutes. The involvement of the RFC in the war economy dwarfed what the RFC had done in the previous 7-8 years in the civilian economy. But Roosevelt knew that we had to do it. And the RFC from 1940 to 1945 authorized more money building up the industrial capacity than the civilian capacity or any other time in the United States. In 1940, the Defense Plant Corporation was created. DPC. And this was a Roosevelt creation to build the industrial base for the war. The RFC was an essential part of this entire war funding process. For example, in 1943, the RFC owned 1,022 plants of the 1,479 plants that were building war munitions for the United States. So that's pretty high percentage, maybe 80%. The DPC, the Defense Plant Corporation set up by Roosevelt, accounted for more than 30% of all new facilities in the nation built. By the end of the war, the United States government owned 5,000 plants, 5,000 factories, primarily used for war production. That's quite amazing. So let me list to you the just 8 key wartime subsidiaries that Roosevelt created and were funded by the RFC. The Metal Reserve Company, the Rubber Reserve Company, the Defense Plant Corporation, the Defense Supply Corporation, the War Damage Corporation, the U.S. Commercial Company, Rubber Development Corporation, Petroleum Reserve Corporation. And the rubber is a very interesting story. If you follow war runs, in those days, it ran completely on rubber. Without rubber, you had no tires, you couldn't move your army. And the United States could not rely on real rubber. So under the RFC, Jones's direction, they created a synthetic rubber industry in the United States to meet the demand. We also built up the magnesium industry, the aluminum industry, and the steel industry. I mean, just to give you an idea what we were looking at then, the United States, in 1939, Japan had 7,700 planes. Germany had 8,295 planes. The US had a mere 2,500 planes and 200,000 men in uniform. And at that point, Roosevelt called for the production of 185,000 planes, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 aircraft guns, plus the uniforms and supplies for 1 million soldiers. And the RFC delivered. And think about all the building materials and products that go into just supplying enough clothes for your army, enough food, enough barracks. It's enormous. Plus, the United States had to prepare for an expanded workforce with women now coming into the workforce. So this was the greatest industrial infrastructure expansion that the world had ever seen. And it was run in large part by not Roosevelt, of course, the president, but Jesse Jones of the RFC. It's hard to give a precise estimate of the total disbursement of money of the RFC over this of 1933 to 1945. The estimates are that the civilian pre-war disbursement was a minimum of 13 billion. That's a fairly good guesstimate. The war disbursement of the RFC was between 20 and 24 billion for the war mobilization. So this puts the total disbursement of the RFC at well over 30,000, 33, 34, 35, possibly more. But this is how this disbursement by the great credit machine, the RFC, reversed the depression and defeated the Axis powers. And it did it by using billions of dollars of credit and no inflation. How many leaders do we have today who understand how this was accomplished, understand the role of productive credit? I think that there'll be so few, we won't even have to bother using our fingers to count them. Now, I want to go into another section of the same application of principle which is the Bretton Woods. But I didn't know, Matt, if you wanted to stop now for questions or just complete and then take questions at the end.
I think for the sake of the completion of the idea, let's go for the full gestalt and go for Bretton Woods, and then we can just pull back and have a Q&A.
Okay. I wanted to give people the opportunity to absorb these concepts. Now, again, as I said at the very beginning, I have a very long background and relationship with Africa. And rightly, many of my African friends and most African leaders, as well as my fellow Americans, complain of the Bretton Woods system, don't like it. They think it's the enemy because of the unfair treatment for developing sector nations. That's true of the Bretton Woods system today. However, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, as we call it, are not what Franklin Roosevelt intended to create in 1944. His intent, which is clear from all discussion during the course of the war, was the elimination of the colonial imperial system and for the development of all nations. So we will discuss what the actual principles of Franklin Roosevelt's Bretton Woods were. And we should look at two presentations before Bretton Woods was created by Roosevelt to get an understanding of what his thinking was way before the United States entered the war. One is the Four Freedoms, which is a part of an inaugural address that Franklin Roosevelt made, not a State of the Union address that Roosevelt made on January 6, 1941. He delivered this message, putting forth basic principles on what the future of the world should look like, as well as the United States, even though this is January 41, almost 1 year before we entered the war. And Roosevelt says, in part, in the future days, in the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his or own right everywhere in the world. The third is the freedom from want, which is translated in world terms means economic understandings, which will secure for every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is the freedom from fear, which translating to world terms means a worldwide reduction in armaments anywhere in the world. These four principles give us a pretty good insight into what Roosevelt was thinking as early as the beginning of 1941. And we see that these are the same principles that guided him to the formation of the Bretton Woods system. But before we get directly to Bretton Woods, there's one other important document that I think people should look at to get an understanding of Roosevelt's post-war policy. And this is the Atlantic Charter. In August 1941, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill meet each other for the first time off the coast of Canada for security reasons, and it was conducted all on US and British ships. I don't think they ever went on land off the coast of Argentina, I think. President Roosevelt, this was his first face-to-face meeting where him and Roosevelt were actually discussing not only the war, but the future of the post-World War period. And it is clear that FDR had a vision of what he wanted before the world ended. And this was an intense discussion by the Roosevelt administration from 1940 to 1945. And Roosevelt wanted it clear that he insisted, as he told Churchill many times, because this was one of many unpleasant discussions between them, that the British colonial control of colonies had to be ended after the war. And one of the features of the Atlantic Charter, which Roosevelt wanted in there, was explicit reference that the colonies of the British system would be free after the war. And there were many arguments back and forth on this Atlantic Charter, which the charter actually represents a compromise. It's not the full intent of what Roosevelt wanted, but he thought it was the best he could get out of Churchill at the time. And it turned out, as this compromise is still contained in it, the key principles against the British or against the British system, but they weren't as explicit as Roosevelt would have liked them to be. However, I'll just read from the third, fourth, and fifth statements on the Atlantic Charter. Third, they, and they refers to the countries, they respect the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Now, Churchill says, oh, this applies to Nazis conquering various countries in Europe. Roosevelt said, these discussions are documented in several places. Roosevelt says, no, this also refers to your colonies. You named India. He said, we want these free also. They have a right to choose. No, 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 you can't do that. And this is very good quotes are carried out in the book as he saw it. But there's also another interesting book, Imperialism at Bay, which has many of these discussions. Fourth, that was the third component of the 8 of the Atlantic Charter. Fourth, they, again, the countries will endeavor respect of their existing obligations to further the enjoyment of all states, great and small, victor or vanquished, of access on equal terms to the trade into raw materials of the world which are needed for economic prosperity. Again, Roosevelt wanted to attack the British imperial system here. And he held back on that, but that's what he's going after, that every country has a right to the wealth of the world to develop its nation. And on the fifth one, he says, they desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the objectives of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. Now, I didn't find out till later on when I was traveling, I began traveling actively in Africa, and my first visit was 1994. But this was already being read by the African nations, who all of them, except in sub-Saharan Africa, all of them except for Liberia, which was a unique case, and Ethiopia. This was being read as a right for them to be free. And of course, this is 1941. They don't become free till 20, 30 years later. We have on July 1st, 1944, in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, was the Bretton Woods Conference was officially opened with introductory remarks by Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. And he was in agreement with Roosevelt on his development policies for the world. However, the real point person at the conference that Roosevelt relied on to do battle was Henry Dexter White. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and he and Roosevelt shared an identical commitment for economic development. Now, most people, if you talk about Bretton Woods, they're familiar with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, because the IMF has become infamous over the years. And its original responsibility was to coordinate currencies and create financial stability between nations. And of course, it's become a means of actually carrying out conditionalities and oppression of economic development. But the second part of Bretton Woods was actually the more important one, in my view, which was the creation of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, which is referred to as the bank, or today people refer to as the World Bank. But the bank, the Reconstruction Bank, the RBRD, was intentionally created, and Dexter White fought for it that they want Roosevelt and White and Morgenthau and a whole bunch of other people, Secretary of State Hull, all kinds of many different parts of the Roosevelt administration. They wanted a new world financial system after the war. And they wanted, as part of that system, the ability for developing nations to develop. And this is very clear if you read through all of the back and forth and discussions and memos and that were written beginning as early as 1942, actually. Harry Dexter White wrote the draft of the final agreement for the creation of the bank, the Reconstruction Bank. And he started writing this, I think, in 42. And he makes explicit Roosevelt's intentions for the bank, quote, and this is in the final agreement in 1944, to assist in the reconstruction and development of territories of members by facilitating the investment of capital for productive purposes. My emphasis, including the restoration of economies destroyed or disrupted by the war, the reconversion of productive facilities for new peacetime needs, and encouragement of, quote, this is all a quote, but this emphasis, including the encouragement of development of the productive facilities and resources in less developed nations. So that's Harry Dexter White, 1942, as he's preparing for Bretton Woods, which would take place 2 to 3 years later. Author Eric Hellheiner, Hellleiner, he wrote a book recently called Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods, International Development and the Making of a Post-War Order. This is very good because it brings in many of the discussions for development that White and Roosevelt were pushing. And now I'm quoting from the author of the book, quote, White outlined innovative provisions for long-term development finance, compensatory short-term balance of payments financing, debt restructuring, commodity price stabilization, the control of capital flight, and this is key, and support for infant industry trade protection in southern countries. He's referring to the developing sector. So there's Harry Dexter White, 1942. These are the policies that Hamilton writes about, protectionism. This is the policies that Lincoln stands on, tariffs for internal improvements. And these are incorporated in the outlook of the Roosevelt administration, not only outlook, but in their founding document that creates the Bretton Woods. Now, this is not understood by most people. They mostly see the Bretton Woods as an evil institution, but that's not what Roosevelt intended it to be. The ideas were not new for Roosevelt. He had discussed this, as I mentioned, in the Good Neighbor policy and the creation of an Inter-American Bank for Latin America, IAB, which was defeated. But the central feature of the IAB, Inter-American Bank, was to promote economic development for the region, for the Americas. In 1936 address to Latin America, Roosevelt says, quote, through democratic processes, we can strive to achieve for the Americas the highest possible standard of living, conditions for all people, end of quote. Thus, we see there is a consistent orientation of Roosevelt to construct a new development based upon a new development-based economic order for the world. Hellheiner comments that the US support for international development was influenced by the values of the New Deal. He writes, quote, if the US president was to be chosen as a pioneer for international development, Franklin Roosevelt deserves the title. Now, preparing for the ideas of the Bretton Woods system, again, White writes in 1942, quote, the lessons that must be learned is that prosperous neighbors are best neighbors, that a higher standard of living in one country gets a higher standard of living in others. In the higher level of trade and business is most easily attained when generously and widely shared. And to those of us involved in current politics, we can say, I would say, are these not the ideas and the basis for the win-win conception of the Chinese Belt and Road, Chinese Silk Road? In White's draft for the Reconstruction Bank, which again was written in 1942, he was explicit that the provisions of the Reconstruction Bank must be involved, quote, a provision for long-term capital for desirable productive projects that serve directly or indirectly to permanently raise the standard of living of the borrowed country. So the Reconstruction Bank was there to make loans at rates and terms that were favorable to raise the standard of living of the borrowing country. How many people realize that that was the purpose of the Reconstruction Bank? White wanted a facility, quote, to supply huge volume of capital that will be needed for relief, reconstruction, and economic development, essential for the attainment of world prosperity and a higher standard of living. Interest on such loans could not be excessive, and loans could not be for the purpose of repaying other loans. So the White, Roosevelt, the entire Roosevelt, not the entire, but a portion of Roosevelt administration was very clear on what Bretton Woods meant for them. Now, it is true that the Bretton Woods Conference was dominated by the advanced sector countries, and they've been attacked. The Bretton Woods Conference has been attacked for this reason. But it's important to know there was significant representation from the developing sector. For example, there were attendees from 19 Latin American countries. There were 4 African countries represented: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South America. And there were 5 delegations from the Asian continent: China, India, Iran, Iraq, and the Philippines. And there was input from all these nations. They had large delegations. In fact, if you add up the delegations from the developing sector, which the author calls the South, it was more than the advanced sector. There were 33 people on the delegation from China, 13 from Brazil, 10 from Cuba, and 8 from India. And it was very clear that the Chinese had a pro-development perspective because this came from their great leader, Sun Yat-sen, and his book, International Development of China. China supported the Bretton Woods Agreement publicly and privately. And in fact, the policies of Sun Yat-sen did correspond with the policies of FDR. Both derived from Hamilton's American system of political economy. Now, who were they fighting at the Bretton Woods Conference? They were fighting the British. The British were represented at the Bretton Woods Conference by John Maynard Keynes, who did not hide his dislike for the conference, nor his dislike for the policies put forward by White and Roosevelt. He also did not hide his contempt for the representatives of the nations from the developing sector. Keynes said of the countries that were invited to the conference, quote, 21 countries have been invited which clearly have nothing to contribute and will merely encumber the ground. And he went on to name those countries. The vast majority were from the developing sector. And he said, he called them, quote, the most monstrous monkey house assembled for years. So the British, they can't control themselves. There he is with all these countries from the developing sector, and all of Africa is practically a British colony. And he calls them the most monstrous monkey house assembled for years. Now, Keynes was not just any representative, as probably people from this platform know. He was the advisor to the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, but more importantly, he was their most famous and influential economist who believed and supported the racist imperialist policies of the British Empire. That is who, or this is who, White was battling the entire time. It was hand-to-hand combat between White and Keynes. Keynes was representing the empire, the British Empire, who opposed this conference and opposed the policies that White and Roosevelt were envisioning for the post-war period. At the heart of the British opposition to Bretton Woods was the fact that the dollar was now going to be the world reserve currency, and all other currencies would be fixed to the dollar and kept within a narrow band of arrangements to prevent speculation. The British now fully realized that the sterling-based system was history. They also opposed the idea of nations determining their own economic development outside of the British imperialist system. Keynes and the Brits did not support the idea of extending large amounts of credit for internal improvements and for industrial development, especially to developing sector nations. Now, as I said, the purpose of the International Monetary Fund was to create a fixed rate exchange system and facilitate stability in currency. So if you traded on the world market, your currency would have the same value today it would have a year or 2 years from now. But the infrastructure, the Reconstruction Bank was formed to lend capital, entirely different question, for internal improvements and development, to develop industries in the developing sector, which didn't exist. John Maynard Keynes opposed this idea. Now, instead of having a IMF and Reconstruction Bank, he proposed a clearing union. And his clearing union would actually be a central bank for central banks. It would not be under the control of governments. And therefore, he was directly usurping the sovereignty of nations. And in Keynes's plan, the dollar would not be the reserve currency, but there would be a new global currency for this new clearinghouse called the Banker, B-A-N-C-O-R, which would be created. Now, White defeated all these policies, especially the proposal for a new global currency. At the heart of Roosevelt's policies for the Reconstruction Bank was his understanding, along with many of his advisors, like he understood in the New Deal, that private investment was going to be insufficient for these countries in Africa, Asia, South America to develop their industrial capability. These developing nations, as Roosevelt, White, and others saw, needed billions and billions of dollars in investments. Roosevelt and his advisors understood that increasing the standard of living of the undeveloped sector would actually benefit the entire world. It would lead to an increase in trade among nations. A constantly rising standard of living would stimulate an increase in exports and imports throughout the entire global economy. Roosevelt understood that an infusion of credit was necessary for these nations and supported the concepts of development. Now, that's the same infusion of credit that Roosevelt and Jesse Jones understood for the United States. So this was one fabric, one clear concept in Roosevelt's mind. After all, Roosevelt had gotten the United States out of depression with his New Deal. He had applied Hamiltonian credit policy, which worked in the United States, beginning in 1933. He rebuilt the US economy through credit, and he created public-private authorities like the Tennessee Valley Authority that physically transformed the US economy. Keynes and the British colonial empire wanted to keep these countries economically backward, to make them permanent agrarian economies. And therefore, the British and Keynes opposed any independent economic or industrial development for these nations. Now, sadly, for those you don't know, the condition in African nations has not changed much. They are largely agrarian-based, not industrialized, and have almost no manufacturing sectors. The hegemony of the British financial system actually achieved its effects after the death of Roosevelt, because Harry Truman took over. The British imperialists wanted a post-World War II order to be controlled by the City of London-dominated financial system. They did not want sovereign nations, especially in the developing sector, to have independent relations with the advanced sector. Now, I'm going to give you one case to show you the intent of the British on this question. And it warms my heart because it's a country I know well, I've been very actively involved in for the last several years, is the case of Ethiopia. It's very instructive. As I mentioned earlier, Ethiopia is one of the 4 African nations attending the Bretton Woods conference. However, it was the leading nation at the conference for sub-Saharan Africa. And therefore, it represented the aspirations of Africans and African Americans all over the world. And the Ethiopians officially supported the Bretton Woods system. Unlike today, under Franklin Roosevelt, the US politically and economically supported the independence of Ethiopia before, during, and after the Bretton Woods conference. Now, the British did get involved out of necessity of defeating the Axis powers. They did get involved in joining forces to kick Mussolini out of Ethiopia in 1941, which Mussolini had invaded the country. And there's a great book on the fight of the Ethiopians called Prevail, written by a Canadian author. But Ethiopia, so they did help remove them, but the British had no intention of supporting an independent Ethiopia. And even though the Ethiopians wanted to assert their own independence, after all, they had never been colonized. They're the only major sub-Saharan African country outside of Liberia that was never colonized. So why should they not be treated as an independent nation? But the British had other ideas. Now, the British wanted to keep them under colonial control, even though they were a free nation. So that's quite contradictory. The Ethiopians wanted to have their own central bank, their own currency, and their own control of their credit, because that's what you need to develop. The British tried to prevent that. The British tried to force Ethiopia to adopt a British pound. A British pound would be their currency, controlled by the British London Currency Board. And so therefore they would be treated, I guess, the same way the Francophone countries have been treated by France in Africa. Ethiopia said, no, we want to control our own currency and our own credit. And we don't really want to be treated as a colony because we're not a colony. Now, in August 1942, Ethiopia reopens the Bank of Ethiopia, which had been closed due to the Mussolini invasion. The Ethiopians cited the Atlantic Charter as justification for having their own independent financial system to promote economic development, as specified in Roosevelt's charter. In May 1944, the Ethiopians had their own new dollar currency produced secretly in the United States. And so the British were faced with a fait accompli that was made possible by Roosevelt. We printed their currency so their bank could function. Officials at the US Federal Reserve called this new monetary reform, this new monetary reform by Ethiopia, quote, a step toward the economic emancipation of Ethiopia. And even though the British were forced to accept this arrangement with Ethiopia, they could not hide their anger. The Brits never can when it comes to racism and imperialism. The British accused the US of, quote, pandering to the worst Ethiopia instincts, rather than giving them advice in accordance with the British school of masterly tradition. I'm not making that up. That's the quote, end of quote. The Ethiopians who were trying to rebuild their country after a 5-year invasion by Mussolini and develop their economic development were described by the British as, quote, nothing more than unqualified, incompetent, and greedy amateurs, end of quote. As I said, the British, they don't hold back. They can't. The Americans in contrast, who wanted to support Ethiopia, complained that the British policy was, quote, dominated by crude concepts of empire and made no effort to help develop this country. Now, keep in mind that as late as 1942, the British are still campaigning, not the UN didn't exist, in the international community, to make Ethiopia a protectorate. Now, why would they be a protectorate when they were an independent country? And again, this was defeated by FDR. Nations from the developing sector in law all were supportive of the Bretton Woods, unlike today, where developing nations oppose it. In particular, they supported the idea of a new financial system that was made to help them in their development, help them obtain prosperity. Unfortunately, Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945. And Truman became the new president. He's the one who appointed Eugene Meyer as head of the World Bank, the Bank for Reconstruction. And Meyer, of course, was a monetarist. He resigned 6 months later, and Truman appointed John J. McCloy, who was an investment lawyer, a banker, a member of the Anglo-American establishment. And he was appointed to head the bank as chairman. And of course, neither one of them, McCloy was there much longer, did not share the development goals of Roosevelt and Harry Dexter White. And he increasingly denied the loans to the developing sector nations and using their imbalance in debts as justification. Now, let me close by reading from you FDR's message on Bretton Woods, because the conference is taking place, of course, he wasn't there. But in February 12th, 1945, 2 months before he dies, he said, delivers a message to the Congress urging adoption of Bretton Woods agreements. Quote, as we dedicate our total effort to the task of winning this war, we must never lose sight of the fact that the victory is not only an end in itself. In a large sense, victory offers us the means of achieving the goal of lasting peace and a better way of life. He continues, these proposals for the International Monetary Fund and International Bank are concrete evidence that the economic objectives of the United States agree with those of the United Nations. They illustrate our unity of purpose and interest in the economic field. What we need, what they need, correspond. Expanded production, employment, exchange, and consumption. In other words, more goods produced, more jobs, more trade, and a higher standing of living for all. To the people of the United States, this means peacetime employment for those who will be returning from the war. And for those at home whose wartime work had ended, it also means orders and profits to our industrial products and fair prices to our farmers. We shall need prosperous markets in the world to ensure our own prosperity. And we shall need goods that the world can sell us. Again, I ask, does this not precisely foretell the win-win strategy of the Belt and Road? And finally, the main job is restoration, is not one of relief. It is one of reconstruction, which must largely be done by local people and their governments. It is at this point that a highly developed economy can play a role in a role of importance to the rest of the world and very profitable for the United States. Roosevelt had intended the Bretton Woods system to be a central feature of his grand design, which included defeat of the British Empire. Unfortunately, much of the world, including Americans, don't know anything about this effort and the real history of the Bretton Woods to promote development. It should be obvious to my African friends that this method of a war-type mobilization to raise the standard of living of African nations, applying Hamiltonian credit, is more than feasible. It has already been done successfully by President Roosevelt. With the creation of an African credit bank, we can accomplish the elimination of hunger and poverty on the African continent today. Hopefully, this lecture will aid in the rediscovery of Bretton Woods and Franklin Roosevelt's strategic understanding of credit and economic development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was a comprehensive presentation and a very needed one too, because I've noticed that the amount of slander and misinformation spread on what FDR was, what he did, how he did it is rampant today, and it's very confusing for many people. And I guess before if anybody has a question, please put your name in the chat box, and I'll call upon you, or a thought you want to share. I've got a question regarding John Maynard Keynes, and I have my own way of approaching this. When people say to me, "Oh, but isn't FDR a Keynesian? Wasn't that the display of Keynesian economics?" And sure enough, there were some people inside of the administration in the 30s who were followers of Keynes's thoughts, but it was absolutely not the case. As you beautifully put it, it was absolutely not the case that this was in any way a Keynesian expression or a Keynesian economic policy. So how do you address that when people say, "But isn't Roosevelt a Keynesian, Green New Deal Keynesian?" Like, it's confusing.
I mean, it's for me, and obviously for you and others, it's crystal clear. I mean, I was even going through this new book on the Bretton Woods that I was reading from. There is two completely opposite points of view. Roosevelt made very clear at the Atlantic Charter and in all his discussions, the Americans opposed the British imperial colonial policy. John Maynard Keynes, who the nicest thing we could say about him is that he was an imperialist and defender of the British policy. I mean, the views could not be more opposite. I think the only reason I can think of that people would tend to say that is because they see Roosevelt using credit to create jobs that a government created. And Keynes at one point talked about using government money to create jobs. They somehow see these as comparable, and there's no really comparison whatsoever. There's no agreement between them. Roosevelt's policy is crystal clear: development, credit for development, industrialization, bringing the third world up to the standard of living of the rest of the world. And this, Roosevelt made very few trips to Africa. I think he had one meeting in Casablanca with wartime allies. And I think he made a stopover in Gambia, which is this tiny little sliver of a country in West Africa. And it was run by the British. And they paid the workers 50 cents an hour. And it was horrible conditions. It was probably the first time Roosevelt had seen sub-Saharan Africa conditions under colonialism. And he never let Churchill forget it. He said, "What you did in Gambia should never be allowed again." And in fact, he would bring it up from time to time. He held a press conference once, and he started coughing. And he said, "Yes, this is something I picked up in Gambia from the way conditions there were." So the worldviews could not be this, even any way, shape, or form be considered alike, but it's used to slander Roosevelt. And Roosevelt really, I mean, if you read all these discussions that I went through today, actually I learned his understanding of economic development and credit was even more profound than I originally thought. There's no question of what he intended the post-war war to be. He was just a beaten old man at 62, suffering from polio and exhaustion, and Truman within hours. I mean, as soon as Roosevelt dies, Roosevelt's vision is dead. It occurs within 24 hours, maybe less. The minute he dies, he was the engine for development of the world and humanity. And when he dies, it all ends. I mean, Truman does a few things here or there, passes Bretton Woods, but nothing. He begins the elimination of Roosevelt's policy. So there's the world really never fully recovered from the death of Roosevelt, followed by the appointment of Truman.
Thank you. The first question that I saw coming in is from Peter. Peter, it's all yours.
Hey, oh, thanks, Matt.
Yep.
Thank you, Professor Freeman. I have a question for you. And I was born in New York. My dad grew up in Astoria, Queens, not far from the Triborough Bridge. So I have a question. Can you explain how President Roosevelt and Mayor LaGuardia got along so well for the development of New York City's infrastructure during the Depression, so that people remember Mayor LaGuardia as the greatest mayor the city ever had? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a New Yorker too. I know exactly, have many friends in Astoria, grew up in Queens myself, and then Manhattan. My wife comes from the Bronx. Yeah, look, that's a whole story, because Roosevelt found or sought out like-minded people who were committed to this infrastructure policy. I mean, I didn't go through it in this lecture, but his whole inner circle of advisors domestically are all in agreement on the role of infrastructure in the United States. And this predates him becoming president. This is also in his, I think he had two-year terms as governor, because at that time it was a 2-year term. And this was evident in his policies as governor, and in the way he interacted with people in the Democratic Party throughout the state of New York. I think LaGuardia was one of his closest allies, if I'm not mistaken, in this process.
And interestingly, LaGuardia was a nominal Republican.
Yeah. Well, don't forget, in those days, the Republicans were much different.
Yeah.
And you could, I'm trying to remember, it was Roosevelt's Republican opponent. And I'm forgetting
Wendell Willkie.
Right, who actually went around the world as a Republican, but he was representing Roosevelt's, quote, democratic policy. At that time, you still had people who thought, as opposed to what we have today, which is almost absent of thought.
Right. Yeah, Willkie's a fascinating guy. I just ordered his book, One World, and yeah, he died in a somewhat mysterious circumstance in 1944, but he was like the New Deal ambassador for the world that had deployed on 2 like giant sweeping voyages, meeting probably much more than dozens of heads of state to prepare the groundwork for the Bretton Woods in the post-war age.
Right.
Very fascinating. Phil, if you're there.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, hi. Gosh, there's an awful lot of threads running through this. So one way for me to kind of think about this and take a slice at it is the developing infrastructure versus credit, right? Or using credit to develop infrastructure. And I'm thinking about that time period that you've been focusing on. And there was a very strong, I guess, sadly, also called America First movement. And that was the Lindbergh Ford, amazingly popular in the central part of the United States, that manufacturing-based, grow the economy through development, I guess. And it was, as far as I understand it, based on listening to talks from E. Michael Jones and others, it was against credit. So credit was viewed as somewhat of a ensnarement. And I'm just wondering, Lawrence, how you slice that up. I absolutely agree with your premise. It's pro-development. Africa should be developed, but versus, say, credit, which is that ensnarement. And one last thought about that. If you could step back like through the 1920s in the boom-bust cycle, I had always heard that was very much related to the overuse, the free credit of the financial sector. So kind of seeing it through the lens of the financial sector versus that more manufacturing Midwest base, we kept us out of the war, don't want to be involved in European entanglements. So I see those 2 threads, and I've heard about those 2 strands in American history. And how do you see that? How do you address that dichotomy, that debate.
Debt, which is credit, like CO2, gets a bad name. The fact of the matter is that credit is a means of carrying out your intention. So you're correct. Look, we've had since 1971, really, when the Bretton Woods system was officially ended, you have all kinds of credit extensions. But what do they go for? The question is, do they meet the criteria of the general welfare? So if you lend someone money, trillions of dollars, to gamble, whether it's gambling in the casino or gambling on the stock market, that credit is evil, and it's wrong, and it's inflationary. So the question is, what is the intention of the credit? Where does the credit go? Where is it intended to go? And what we have seen throughout history, and this predates the United States, this goes back to some of the more thoughtful, enlightened people in Europe in the 16, 17, and 1800s. We see this in the writings of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, we see it in the writings of Leibniz and others, that the credit is a means to carry out an intent. So it really comes down to intent. You could lend trillions of dollars for Wall Street gambling, and all that credit would be wrong. It would be evil. It would be counterproductive. But you can lend credit for actually something that leads to an improvement in the productive powers of society to create more wealth for the growth of your population, both in its size and in its standard of living. So you have to know what your intention is. The intention is everything. And that's why I began my class with the discussion of the general welfare, because that's his intention. And he never wavers from it. He compromises along the way many people have to compromise. Lincoln had to compromise. But he never wavers from the principle. What is your principle? What is in your mind, your heart? What is your mindset? And Roosevelt he learned enough about credit from reading Hamilton that he was going to use this. And he took the RFC, which was a useless institution under Hoover, because all it was doing was lending money to banks. And he took this useless institution, and by changing its authority, he made it a vehicle to carry out his intent, which was to end the Depression, win the war, and actually transform the world through his Bretton Woods system. And that's what you have to look for. You always have to look for your intent, because that's the only way you know what someone is doing. Someone can appear to actually be doing something that, quote, looks normal, but what's their intent? And your intent tells you whether the policy is going to be good or bad. So the people, without addressing the political aspect of what you're saying in terms of the American firsters not wanting to get us into the war, the fact of the matter is Roosevelt's policies as governor, his allies, as we discussed in the previous question, and his policies for the post-World War were always consistent. The intent was always consistent. Human beings, there's nothing like us human beings anywhere. There's no animal like us, there's no computer like us, there's no artificial intelligence like us. We are so completely unique. That's why I get so angry when I see people dying or living degraded lives. And human beings require a certain material standard of living to actually fulfill their humanness, which is the use of their mind. This is ABCs of economy. So you use credit to get you somewhere where you're not. You want to get somewhere. The way Roosevelt's mind worked, I'm pretty sure of this, is he had a vision for the United States under difficult circumstances, depression, which Hoover had made worse. He also had a vision for the world, which came out in all his discussions with the British, against the British. So therefore, he's looking into the future. Now, he may have been looking at least certainly 5 to 10 years, maybe longer into the future, which is what any great statesman does. And then the question is, how do you get there? Because you see something in your mind, your creativity gives you a place to look at, which doesn't really exist. Like a post-world order that he was thinking about didn't exist. Then you have to figure out, how do you create it for the benefit of human beings? And credit is a means to get to the future. But what is your future? If your future is to create a gambling casino, then the credit is evil. If your future is to lift up mankind, because human beings are the most precious species we know, then your intention is based on the general welfare principle and the common good. So that's why it's very easy for me, and I'm sure others who have studied this. It's very easy to tell what's a good policy or not. Even if both policies would have certain similarities, somewhat what Matt was saying with Keynes's work program, you look at the intention and you see right away what a policy is. That's why I can see things very, very clearly in terms of US geopolitical policy and especially US policy to Africa. My African friends have a horrible time figuring out what the US is doing, and they're often confused. I see it totally clearly because I know what the intent of certain people is. Not everybody, but I know what the intent is. And once you know the intent, then you can understand what the various actions are. So credit for infrastructure which develops man's material existence so he can focus on his spiritual existence. This has always been cherished by great leaders. Roosevelt had the opportunity through the RFC to do something that really hadn't, it existed in various ways on the Hamilton, on the Quincy Adams, on the Lincoln, on the McKinley and others. But Roosevelt had this damn RFC, which he could channel billions and billions of dollars into to build up the US economy and to win the war. And we've never seen a credit machine like that in our lifetime. That actually is a credit machine for good. And so I think, and it's created by debt. Debt is credit. The two are synonymous. The question is, what do you do with it? And the fact of the matter is, Roosevelt and better people around him knew what to do. But you see how fragile it is, because the minute he dies, I forgot what time of day he slumped over down in his home in Georgia. But the minute he dies, the Anglo-Americans take over through Truman. And everything he wanted is so quickly undone. It lingers on for a while, and you have John F. Kennedy picks up on it later on, but his life is very short. In fact, if you want to see communication of ideas, there's a picture I saw when I was down in Georgia visiting Roosevelt's home where he was recovering from. And was it Warm Springs, Georgia, or Hot Springs, Georgia? And there's a wonderful photograph there of Kennedy, a picture of Kennedy staring at a portrait of Lincoln. And you see in that picture, which I have a postcard I keep in my office, you see the communication of ideas from one generation to the next of people with the same intent for the development.
Mm.
Thank you. That was very lucid. Thank you, Professor.
I got a quick question. I'm gonna just sneak in there in front of Jerry. I'm sorry, Jerry. But in regards to the FDR's ability to force the Federal Reserve to behave, I know that there was a fight in my reading between the factions who wanted to continue to use the Federal Reserve as an institution of subversion within the USA, and FDR somehow managed to get, I know, one of his allies into a position as chairman, and he forced it to behave. I'm curious, how did he do that? And number two, did he ever think about setting up a third national bank, like an actual Hamiltonian bank, or did he not talk about that?
I'm not sure I know the detail you do on this question around the Federal Reserve. I mean, I do have an understanding of his thinking. When you're president, like Lincoln had to deal with the question of slavery, he waited a long time because he didn't have support for it to get rid of slavery. When you're president, you have to figure out how to get, again, where you want to go. You know what your intention is. How do you get there? And you have to deal with all these factions, all these horrible people, all people who oppose you. And then, of course, there's people who agree with you. So you're constantly judging what your capability is, what compromises you can make, which compromises you can't make. And you're figuring out how to move the situation forward. Now, the Federal Reserve, was a disaster from the time it was set up. I think it was a major banking establishment after the 1863 Banking Act. I'm not sure about that, but I think it was. So it was a disaster because the way it was set up to be run by private banks. Now, whether Roosevelt thought he could overcome that or not, I don't know. I don't know the answer to. But if you look at the question you raised about a national bank, the national bank is a principle that Hamilton was just a genius in figuring out how to take the colonies at their condition with approximately $72 million in debt, reorganize it, unify them, establish a fund to pay it off, and then allow people who had the debt to buy into the bank so that the debt became a basis of the capital base. I mean, the mechanics of it are pretty amazing. But the concept was always clear. And you get that from reading his report on manufacturing. The concept of Roosevelt's RFC, he didn't really need a national bank to get the task at hand. Like Hamilton's task at hand was to regroup the country and build it into a nation from colonies. Roosevelt's task at hand was to save the country and then also to establish Bretton Woods, which he did through this Reconstruction Bank. Which, I'm not sure you'd call it a Hamiltonian bank, but it had a similar purpose. But with the RFC, he had his national bank. He would have had more difficulty because the authority was given under Hoover. So he was just using Hoover's authority, who had actually created the bank, and he transformed the RFC. But he didn't even initiate it. He transformed something that was there. So it was the least action way of actually carrying out a Hamiltonian principle without calling it a national bank. I don't think Lincoln ever called the Greenbacks or the Banking Act of '63 a national bank either. So each president, great leader, is faced with a task that is practical to the period they live in, and how they then transform those ideas to carry it out. Now, there is legislation, I don't know if you're aware of it, by friends of mine who there is a piece of legislation, House Resolution 3339, to set up a national bank in the United States. It's actually been entered into Congress. Not that much support for it, but the people behind it are very clear, including this guy's book I read from Feinberg. I think he supports it. And they want to capitalize $5 trillion to become a lending facility for $50 or $500 trillion. And it's the same thing. People would buy stock in the bank, and that stock would then become the capital base to lend money out. So once Hamilton comes up with this idea, it can be applied in many different ways, because then the principle works. The question, and again, it refers to our earlier discussion, what's your intent? And each president or leader has to deal with the hand dealt him to figure out how to carry out his intention as a leader. Now, we don't really have leaders like that anymore, either Republican or Democrat. So we're in a very, very serious, profound crisis in my United States. And I don't see any leadership on the horizon that's going to actually change that in the short term. But that is what you need. You need leadership for things like this.
Thank you. Jerry.
Yes, thank you very much, Larry. That was an excellent presentation. I especially enjoyed the part about the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. I never heard anyone explain it as good as you about how Roosevelt used that. And the interesting thing was that Hoover set it up and he used it. And well, it's more of a comment than a question, but building on what Peter said about who Roosevelt worked with, it's like today, if you look at say, the Democratic Party. I mean, it's a horrible party, Biden and Obama and this mess. And older people like ourselves, when we think of the Democratic Party, we think of Roosevelt, FDR. But if you think of what the Democratic Party was before FDR, it was horrible. It was a horrible party. I mean, if you were African American, you were Republican. You know,
Right.
you were Lincoln. The slave owners were Democrats. So the interesting thing with Roosevelt working with these Republicans is he was the head of a horrible party that he had to operate on principle and not party politics. So I don't know if you wanted to comment more on that, but I thought it was interesting. Peter brought that up.
What Roosevelt did is what any great leader of statesman, he transformed the party to be his party. You're right. I mean, the Democrats were horrible. They were horrible policies, and there was nothing good to say about them. But he took a party and he transformed it, not to stretch the metaphor too far, but he created it in his own image. I mean, he said, this is what I stand for, and I'm going to drive the party and push the party and pull the party, and I'm the president. So he made the party in his own image. I mean, and they, because of depression conditions, they had to submit because conditions were so bad, and Hoover had failed so much as a Republican. And then in the wartime conditions, there was very little choice they had because we were fighting a war against an evil force. But he did what you would want to do. He said, I'm the Democrat, so now I will remake the Democrat Party in my image. I mean, with Lincoln, it was a bit different because Lincoln, he actually he was part of the creation of the Republican Party. It didn't exist. I think he was in the founding meeting, I think in 1958 or so, 56. And so it was a different condition for him. There were other people like him, although the Republican Party that he formed was a coalition of many different groups. I forget they were all different names. I mean, I'm not sure. The Free Soil Party, I think, was part of it. I think maybe the Know Nothings were part of it. I can't remember all the groups. But he was one of the key people who molded the Republican Party into the Republican Party that really represented a principle. And that is because he became president. If he wasn't president, we don't know which way the Republican Party would have gone. I mean, there were many good Whigs in it. So that's the advantage of having a leader who has an idea of what he wants for the world. That's the most important thing. When we, in the United States today, every discussion, and I have friends in various circles that are not even that political. I'm an avid hiker and backpacker, so I spend hundreds of hours and hundreds of miles hiking and camping out with people. And everybody I talk to, they're controlled by the way the debate is controlled. You for or against gun control? Are you for or against abortion? Are you for or against this or for or against that? There's nobody who has a concept that you can't discuss in 2 minutes. You may have to take several hours. I'm forgetting the name of the senator who made this 4-hour speech on the floor of the Senate in the 1850s, who then got beaten up by his opposition.
Charles Sumner.
Yeah, Charles. Now, do you think there's anybody in the Congress today that can give a conceptual speech for several hours? No. I mean, there isn't anybody in the Republican Democrat Party who could. They can't. And you think the population, like look at the Douglas debates, the Lincoln Douglas debate, people would stand up for 2 hours and listen to two guys debating policy, and each one spoke for an hour. Do you think it's possible that attention span exists today? No, it doesn't, because we've destroyed a culture. So even though it's a hard effort, every time we do one of these presentations and bring back the idea, we're trying to create a renaissance. It's very difficult because the thinking power of people is so little, so small, so narrow, and so controlled. People don't even know it. When they say Russia is the enemy, They're just doing that because that's what they read. They probably have never given 2 seconds of thought as to what's happened over the last 30 years in Russia. These are the difficulties we're up against. The fact that we had great leaders gives us the possibility of referencing them and bringing that back. And that's the Constitution, I believe, is ingrained in the United States, although it's very covered over with a lot of crud. But nevertheless, this is what we have to do. We have to base ourselves on some positive perspectives, some leaders of the past, and try to kindle a resurfacing of that kind of more elevated thinking in the present.
Thank you. Russell, did you want me to read your question? No, are you on mute? You're on mute.
There you go. Sorry about that technology. Yeah, firstly, thank you, Professor, for a really illuminating discussion. I'm from a different part of the world, so a lot of the things that you've been talking about I've heard of, but really great to put them into a context for me. So I'm actually from Zimbabwe and South Africa, so very interested in what you're talking about. And you know, I lived through a beautiful time in Zimbabwe post-independence. It kind of fell apart in the mid-90s. You know, there was a sort of Maoist, Africanized Maoist system that was pushed out in the mid-90s by World Bank, IMF structural reform. And it really tore society apart and led to the situation which ultimately led to civil war and a kind of, well, I think we'd all agree, a economically destroyed nation. So, you know, listening to you talk about the World Bank and the problems of the World Bank, and you're proposing that a credit system, and I'm fully convinced by the credit system, you're proposing that a credit system might solve standard of living problems, you know, may even address cyclical famines and that sort of thing. So my question is, and you mentioned it's all about good intent. So the World Bank lends through African governments, and from what you're saying, that question of intent would be settled by, how can I put it? People who control the lending, making ethical decisions with maybe by lending direct even to end users rather than going through the mechanisms of governments and banks. And I'm trying to envisage what that practically means. Does it mean establishing sort of national banks in various countries, or how do you see that we would escape the middlemen who seem to not have good intent? I think that's my question. Yeah.
Well, you know, the World Bank, I mean, they lend money, but they have no intent on developing Africa. And you know that how? By the way they lend the money. They lend money, small amounts, short-term, high interest rates. So that's the problem, right then and there. With Africa, and I know Zimbabwe well, I worked with some people there for many years. What is Africa missing right now? That since slavery, 1430s began, through colonialism, and then neocolonialism, and the African countries become free in the 1960s, and they were under neocolonialism of the World Bank and the IMF under this perverted form. There's no development in the nation. The African nations are not lent money that would actually lead to an improvement in the conditions of life. They are controlled and manipulated by debt primarily. So for me, it's very obvious. You have 100 to 120,000 megawatts of power for sub-Saharan Africa for over 1 billion people. 40,000 megawatts is in South Africa. So everyone else is dying from lack of energy. I mean, if you break down per capita use, it might be 25 watts per person in Nigeria. So my calculations, we need 100,000 gigawatts of power, for which I would advocate a large portion of nuclear energy. Now, this is obvious, but there's no development money. for infrastructure in Africa. The Chinese have begun to do it on a limited scale. I mean, it's limited from my standpoint. It's not necessarily limited from African standpoint. But why it's so obvious that if you want to help Africa, rather than spending hundreds of billions of dollars on aid and counterterrorism training, develop the land. If you develop the Sahel, you could eliminate the violent extremists. You could eliminate migration. And I'm convinced, and if I had the power, I can eliminate poverty and hunger in Africa. The problem is there's no desire to do that. There's no intent. Since the last, we have Roosevelt, which I went through, he did intend to do this, and he was involved in African countries. John F. Kennedy has a special relationship with Africa, even as a senator. And then as president, he works with Kwame Nkrumah, the most famous liberation African, and he helped build the Volta Dam project, which is the greatest infrastructure project that Ghana's ever had, even though it was finished in '66. After that, there's nothing. There's aid money. Now I want to help a starving person, but that's not enough. Where is the intent for development? Okay, so the IMF is never going to do it. You have to have an institution that's intent is the development of Africa, which requires primarily energy and railroads immediately. Now people say, well, you can't do that. Where's the money going to come from? Well, that's a nonsensical question, really, because we create money, we create credit, i.e., we're sending we probably, as a result of so far of the last 3 months, the United States has given Ukraine over $50 billion. Leaving aside whether that's going to lead to a war, or we're supposed to eliminate war, or may lead to war, is what we're doing. Just take the $50 billion. Where did that come from? We created it. The United States Congress lawfully signed a resolution a suggestion from the president, and we're now $50 billion worth of goods and material is being supplied. So that's debt to the United States. Now, why couldn't we take a concept that's $50 billion and use it to develop Africa? Now that 50 billion wouldn't develop the continent, but it would go a long way towards beginning the process of developing the continent.
I hear what you're saying. I'm just wondering the mechanism of disbursement of the funds.
Well, you could do it several ways. The idea of having a national bank in each country is good. They should have a Hamiltonian national bank, but they could also be lending money directly to the government or to an authority that is set up. Let's say, for example, this is something I thought about when I first arrived in Nigeria in 1994. You could set up an East-West Railroad Authority, like the Tennessee Valley Authority in Nigeria, and lend money to that authority. And that authority would lend money in tranches of expenditure based on the progress of that East-West Railroad. You could do it. We did it with the Tennessee Valley Authority. I want to create a national infrastructure, an African infrastructure bank, which would have a capital base from selling its stock. And then that bank would lend out money to specified infrastructure projects with co-guarantees from that nation. But they also have to be regional projects because these railroads would cross over many countries. This is something that's perfectly feasible. It could have been done. The United States and the West has no intention of doing it. It's not even on their radar. Now you look at the case of Ethiopia. They're building the Grand Renaissance Dam, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, GERD. It's going to be the biggest hydroelectric power plant on the continent. They did it themselves. They didn't borrow any money. People say they got it from China. These people are idiots. They did it through selling bonds to their own people, their own employees of the government. So $5 billion was raised by Ethiopia. So they are beholden to nobody. Now, why don't we have one US political leader, much less our president, has ever supported this? Why won't we support it? Because we don't believe in the development of Africa. Why isn't there any support for this? Not one press release has ever been issued.
It's a wonderful idea. I mean, So when you're talking about the dam in Ethiopia, it relies on a national initiative rather than a centralized initiative like the World Bank.
Correct.
Because we have the integrity of not just the World Bank to worry about, but then national governments and banking institutes. So I wondered if there was a different mechanism, but I guess if you're saying that if at the originating at the World Bank, if there was a good enough motive, how can I put it, intent, as you say, that would define how funds were given out.
But they're not going to do it. You have to accept the reality. They're not going to do it. Bretton Woods, despite Roosevelt's intentions, is useless right now. What we have to do is set up another bank that could be supported by all kinds of institutions. There is an African Development Bank. It says very tiny. I mean, it lends out in hundreds of millions. We need trillions of dollars invested in the next 10 years in Africa, like we need in the United States. So if you can't do it as capital budget outlays, you can do some stuff. Like the Ethiopians built this train between Addis Ababa and Djibouti. I was on it in 2016, and that was out of capital budget. And then they raised this money themselves. Now, the government did it. The first dirt that was overturned was 2011 by Meles Zenawi, who was their prime minister, who died a year or two later. And then it was carried over by the government of the TPLF. And now it's been carried over by the government of Abiy Ahmed. So the project was actually run by the government with Ethiopian people. So it's part of their identity. That's why these idiots in Washington and this foolishness of the president of Egypt, nobody's ever going to stop the Ethiopians from doing this. They would rather die than give up the GERD. Plus the fact it's going to go through its third refilling in about 4 weeks. So it's a done deal. But my concern is, why doesn't it get support from the West? And that shows you the mentality. We don't believe in development. No, Kennedy was our last president. Johnson, Nixon, Bush again, all Clinton, Obama, Trump, none of Biden. They don't have a conception of development. So we're in a vast land. So the Chinese are moving in and they're attacked. Why are they attacked? Because they're carrying out development. We have an international, somebody called it was a good name, a humanitarian imperialist grouping. Because under the guise of humanitarianism, they want to give aid, they want to help people, and let's move aid into that grade, which is good, medical supplies, food. But they are opposed to development. NGOs and others, they say CO2 is destroying Africa. Let's leave their argument aside, because I'm a friend of CO2. But just take the idea, one of the things that goes on in Africa, which I saw when I was in Mali, is they're burning now forests left and right. Now, trees would help them. Trees would bring in transpiration and stop the desert from moving. So they really don't want to cut down trees. But the environmentalists and the NGOs say, we have to cut down trees. Okay, fine. They want you stop being an idiot and give them electricity, and they won't cut down the trees. I mean, I was in a house in Mali where they bought charcoal. Charcoal is known thousands of years ago by the Bantus who created charcoal to feed their iron industry. It's just covered, you burn wood covered by dirt and you create charcoal. Well, good, then give them electricity, give them gas. Not one NGO, not one organization that took up my call for 1,000 gigawatts of power for Africa, because they don't want to. They have an ideology, or they just have a severe deficit in their education that they can't conceptualize what has to be done.
Yeah.
So I don't think the World Bank, IMF, unless there's a complete revolution, which coming from somewhere, I don't know where it is, I don't think they're going to do it. I think we have to do is create another banking institution that's totally committed. And I've been trying to write something for an African Infrastructure Development Bank. But I haven't.
Well, good luck.
Yeah, good luck. Yeah.
Big task. Yeah.
Oh yeah. You got to start somewhere.
They let you give $1 a day and think that you're changing the world, but nothing that's actually allowed to change the world.
But the question is, do they even want to change the world?
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. That's the intention question. All right. So we got time for a couple. Okay. The last question I see here is, or maybe two questions. Kelly, you've been waiting for a while.
Hi, how you doing? Yeah, I just want to thank you for your presentation. You have a pleasing way of explaining things. Yeah, just during this the Depression, like the country's broke, and the president he takes I think you said he takes the country off the gold system, and he
Roosevelt did.
Pardon me?
Roosevelt took the country off the gold system.
Okay. And there's the establishment of this this Reconstruction Financial Corporation, and then there's this whole issue about like credit being established, and I'm just kind of curious, like, can you expand on how exactly is this credit established? Like it almost seemingly comes out of nothing.
Right. What it does. Debt and credit come out of nothing. That's the beauty of having a government that understands its responsibilities outlined in our preamble. It's exactly what you're doing. The RFC was established by Hoover. So he creates an authority. And then he says, we will sell stock for the RFC, and the Treasury will buy $500 million of RFC stock. So now the Treasury has created money out of thin air, has this paper saying they have stock to the RFC. So the question is whether the RFC will function and produce a functional role for the country and also not lose any money. It actually didn't lose any money. And you can pay your people back. What did Hamilton do? Hamilton said, well, I've created this new bank. You guys out there who lent us money during the war, who are carrying these bank certificates for 6% interest, I will allow you to use those instruments of debt, which they couldn't get money for anywhere. And you can now help capitalize this bank. And instead of paying you 6%, I'll pay you 4%. Instead of paying you over 4 years, I'll pay you over several more years. And they took the deal. So the debt, which is money they lent in the revolutionary period, becomes an instrument for credit. How's that? Because credit is what you said, it is a creation. And that's what every institution has ever done, is it gets credit. If the credit is invested wisely, it performs a function for society and actually makes a profit at the same time. And I think I think Hamilton took out a $10 million loan to cover some of the existing debt. And then you create a way of paying back the debt. So the problem people have is they don't understand credit. And debt is like a boogie word. That's what I was saying. Debt gets a bad publicity.
Yeah, for me, it's a bad word.
Yeah, it's like CO2 to the environmentalists. They hate it. I like credit, and I like CO2. So, but I know those are both buggy words with various people. But just think about it. If you want to get from here to there, you take a car, a train, a bus, or you walk. I walk hundreds of miles in the mountains of Pennsylvania and Virginia and West Virginia. All right, so if you want to get from here to there economically, what are you going to do? Are you going to wait to saving up your pennies until you have enough money to make an investment? No, you take out a loan, credit. And if the credit is valuable, and if the credit is backed by the nation, which these treasury notes are, then quote is as good as your country. And you invest it in building something because someone else accepts that credit. So you can get the steel you need, you can hire the workers you need, you can get the bill of materials you need. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way civilization grows and develops. It doesn't, savings will never be sufficient. As I said, Ethiopians pulled I guess the British call it one-off. I mean, they actually did it. They actually got $5 billion from their people to build this dam. But that's great. And that's a wonderful model. But think about how you're going to get trillions of dollars to build the energy and railroads that we need in Africa. You can't. So you're going to have to create a credit bank that's dedicated. And I think one of the things I read to you from the Reconstruction Bank is that the money that the bank would lend could not be used to pay back loans. That's a very good provision. And that's a provision I would make too if I was running a bank, for an infrastructure bank. This money can only be used for purchases that will lead to the improvement of the economy through infrastructure. And paying back loans is not part of it. You'll have to find another way to pay back that loan. But credit is confidence in the future. You believe in the future, you believe in your government of the future, you believe in the soundness of your principle, but it is always about believing in the future. And that's, we've lost that. But that's what credit is. It's a belief in the future. Now it's a sound belief in the future.
Yeah.
So when all this started, it was a good thing.
When all
And
what,
then,
you mean the Bretton Woods?
well, this whole credit, like issuing credit, like when they started this, they had, you know, good people in there, and it became a good thing. And then somewhere down the line, it gets corrupted.
It gets more corrupted. I mean, President Jackson, was it Andrew Jackson? He eliminated Hamilton's bank when he tried to get it set up again. It was in 20 years. So the first one was 1791 to 1811. And then they had to wait a period of time. So yeah, you have leaders come in who destroy it, but then it was reset up. Then Lincoln didn't set up a national bank. He created greenbacks, government-backed notes that had 4% interest on them, I think. Roosevelt does it differently. He takes an existing institution and he finds a way. So it's a very tumultuous up and down course based on who's in control and who's the leader of it. I mean, people attack the hell out of China, but I can't figure out what China is doing wrong. It's subsidizing certain major banks to give low interest loans, mainly the Ex-Im Bank. I mean, if you get a 3% loan for 15 years to build something, that's real value. To me, that's very valuable, because then you don't have to have onerous, usurious repayment. So
And then somewhere down the line, they raise the interest on you.
Well, you're referring to something in particular, I don't know.
Well, I'm just thinking of a personal loan, you know?
Oh, well, forget personal. Don't, look, this talk that you hear from politicians are idiots. This is not kitchen table talk. This is not people getting around the kitchen table trying to figure out the budget. That's ridiculous. Credit comes from governments, comes from institutions. The individual person, their credit card has absolutely zero to do with the government issuing credit. This the government, and read the Constitution, because I didn't go into it for time purposes. But the General Welfare Clause is mentioned the second time in the US Constitution under the power of the Congress to create credit. So this is a power given to us in our Constitution. I forget if it's Article 1 or 2, and it's given to us. So we're doing it lawfully. The government has the power to create credit. Therefore, it's a lawful creation. The question is, what is the intent? Mm-hmm. And our government uniquely makes it a part of our actual Constitution, which is, in my mind, the only document that's holding this country together. Otherwise, I think we could split apart again. But the Constitution moors us to a very high principle by some geniuses, white male geniuses, if you will. But it's in the Constitution that we can create credit. So we're not doing anything wrong. The question is, what the intent is. That's why I get so angry with people. They say, well, you can't create those hundreds of billions of dollars. I say, the banking system creates it every day for gambling purposes, for lending people on Wall Street money. But why can't we create it for something good? and people's mind goes into a fog. They can't think of that because we're so brainwashed on economics.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, not all debt is created equal.
There you go.
So yeah, that's I mean, one of the ideas I often throw out is just to help people conceptualize sometimes the difference between good debt versus bad debt, since everyone has been really traumatized by living in debt under decades of a post-industrial consumer society that let go of its old productive values that actually said, before I was born, you know, I understand that the way we built our economies after World War II was the idea that if you're going to have an investment into something, it has to have measurable productive effects. You know, that you if you had more money in circulation one year compared to the last year, it was because it was justified by an analog of increased agro-industrial productivity in some way. So you had some real metrics there to judge whether, oh, is your money increasing, but your actual powers of productivity decreasing? If so, then that money increase, there's a fraud going on, and you could rectify it. Whereas after 1971, we lost those standards, and everything just became worshiping money for profit's sake and not thinking about, well, what are you cannibalizing for the future? What are you destroying for the future by not maintaining or improving your infrastructure or R&D? So, I mean, for a personal like if you think about it on an individual level, if you have skills, you have all the knowledge of a farmer, and you just don't have the tools. You don't have a tractor, the tools, or land, but you have all the knowledge, right? It's real power you have inside of you. Well, what are you going to do? Just like let your power go to waste? You know, you have no money. You have no money to buy your tools. So no, if you can go and get a loan, you'll create a sort of debt at a reasonable interest. You'll buy your tools, you'll buy your tractor, you'll get a bit of land, but that land will become so productive in a couple of years that you'll extinguish your debt, and you'll have more abundance to now all of a sudden upgrade your labor, you could hire more farmhands, you could pay for better equipment, you always have that idea of a good debt extinguishing itself, like Hamilton said. So why would you let yourself starve, let your community starve because you have a bunch of people with skills who don't have money, right? Might as well. And then you can think about that on a national and a continental and a global level as the same principle. And it works pretty nicely.
I don't know if the previous questioner has ever read Hamilton's report on credit, report on manufacturers. He just went through the same thing that Matt went through. I mean, how credit actually increases the value of land, increases the value of the farmer. These are not, the reason we have so much difficulty with these concepts is because we've been brainwashed by horrible economic classes and theories that are dominant in terms of looking at Adam Smith or looking at Milton Friedman or looking at any of these people. Really, if everybody in society was required to study Hamilton, we'd have a far better educated country. But the question of individuals and government is not the same. Individuals do not have the power to create debt. In fact, states don't have the power to create debt, but the US federal government does. And therefore, you can't look at these things as equals. And that's why I hate this thing when presidents talk about kitchen table talk, because that has nothing to do with how to run a country. It's to appeal to the common man, be folksy, but it's actually stupid. And it treats the American citizen as if they don't have a mind.
So you got one follow-up question. I guess that'll be the last question. And I think also Peter, just had two contributions to make to the conversation. He made a point that you were searching for which was the article in the Constitution giving the authority to the state to emit credit. And he said it's Article 1, Section 8, Introduction and First Dependent Clauses. And then he also pointed out Lincoln's national bank system did that in 1863 Currency Act by establishing U.S. government treasury debt as capital for national banks. Good point, Peter. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So follow-up question from Phil.
Yeah, hi. So Matt, great analogy of the farmer, and Lawrence is specifically drawing a difference between that personal level of capital, debt and empowerment, and the government level. So on the government level, Lawrence, who pays back? How does it get paid back? Should it be paid back? It's not the kitchen table. So now I've sent $1 trillion to whatever, Zimbabwe, to build nuclear power plants. What's the incentive for the folks in Nigeria who out of their pockets lent that collective $1 billion? The incentive is very clear. What other than, I don't know, general welfare, humanitarian purposes, how do you move capital to that investment and that credit, and how does it get paid back, or should it get paid back to the government?
Well, there's multiple levels of how you can look at that. If you're lending money, like the Chinese fully expect their loans to be repaid. And if you make an investment of long term, I'm saying at least 10 years, maybe 15, and that investment is a thoughtful investment, that country will see an increase in their wealth. The increase in their wealth enables that country to pay back the loan if it's not a usurious interest rate and it's not short term. So on one level, there's no charity involved. There's simple, non-usurious lending practices that are intentionally there to develop that country. The energy levels are so bad in Africa and the infrastructure is so bad that if you would have an infusion of credit, you would see a very quick increase in the economy. And now they are agricultural based, and they will be agricultural based in the short term. But we have to begin the process of bringing in manufacturing. But even on the agricultural base, right now, African countries spending over $30–40 billion importing food, and it could go up. And that's a pure waste. Suppose they didn't have to spend $40 billion importing food. And that's from their foreign exchange, because their currencies are not accepted internationally. So their foreign exchange they get from the West currencies they collect is wasted by importing food. Now, if they grew the food themselves, they would be bringing in income into that country. If you build a train, which is the Ethiopians did also, from Djibouti to Addis, over many years, Kenya's built a train too, from Mombasa to Nairobi. These trains will produce a value, not that the train, collecting the tickets on the train will create a value, but the improvement in the transportation of goods and people will increase the economy. So the economy will make a profit, and then the government has to either tax or other ways to take part of that profit from the economy and pay back the loan. So the loans, there's no reason to assume they wouldn't be profitable if they meet the requirements of long-term and low interest. Now then you bring up the question of charities. Now, I have a very radical proposal, which my African friends get pretty whacked out about, which is, given the amount of money we spend on aid, US aid, I don't know what it is, it's enormous, just for the United States. Given the amount of money we spend on counterterrorism, which in some parts of Africa, billions and billions of dollars, given the concern everybody has for my so-called for migration going into Europe, you could, and I wouldn't be against it if I was president of the United States, you could give a grant that is a gift, a grant, and say, we won't charge you at all as long as you build this railroad, as long as you build this power plant. We'll pay for it. Now, I don't know what that'll cost. I mean, 5 billion, 10 billion, 20 billion, that's nothing compared to the loss of life and the money that we pour out to these countries. So you could do it and it would still be profitable from the standpoint of the general welfare and physical economy. If we gave money, instead of just dribbling out aid or counterterrorism or other things, we actually gave a block of money to build a specific infrastructure project, we wouldn't lose any money. And we would gain. And again, the example I gave in the speeches from Roosevelt and White, and the same ones that we hear from the Chinese, if you raise the standard of living of another country, you're increasing your market. So those people may, as their standard of living improves, they're no longer just going to buy consumer goods from us, which is kind of weak and it's unfair to them because we dump consumer goods on. They will start to demand capital goods. they will start to demand advanced high technology capital goods. And we can start selling goods to a market. As Roosevelt said, I think I read in his speech, we can then have a new market for goods that we specialize or used to specialize in selling. So that grant that we gave them may turn out to be very profitable. Now, I know this is an extreme idea because everybody's so worried about their personal economy. And, you know, my standard of living is not very high either, but you can't let that trap you. People don't see the potential of actually advancing the economic conditions of life. And that spurs on a rising standard of living will increase trade and commerce around the world. Therefore, to answer your question, yes, you could. Although it would be blasphemy in terms of the economics today, you could do it, and it would actually be profitable for the world economy.
Hey, we all do better when we all do better.
Well, isn't that the name of your web, Rising Tide Foundation? Rising tide lifts all ships.
Yeah, they got that from a JFK speech.
Yep.
Actually, I heard it first in a Xi Jinping speech, and then I was like, well, where does this come from? And yeah, I found the only other reference earlier on was JFK.
No, it wasn't JFK. It was Ted Kennedy.
No, JFK used it in 1961 to.
I heard it from Ted Kennedy on the floor of the Senate in the 70s or 80s.
He stole it from his brother.
Hey,
But yeah, and it was talking about continental water projects. That was the speech he was promoting. Was all of the West Coast.
Know that. Okay, that's new to me. I heard it from Ted.
I'll send you the link. Cool. Larry, thank you so much. This was a great afternoon. We learned so much, and I really, really am glad that this is so comprehensive. You chose to really tackle not just the green. See, they got me. Not just the New Deal or the Bretton Woods, but really putting these as two chapters within a story is key to put that out there. I'm glad that there was some great questions, especially Phil. Wonderful pushback, because that's reflective of a big fight going on right now over the zeitgeist. Is over the question of everything you just asked about, FDR versus Keynes, Hamilton versus Jefferson, the glorification of Jackson, the genocidalist, racist killer of the national bank and real British asset in America, who people today have thought he's the great hero because he paid the debt. My God. So, I mean, we touched on so many key charged sacred cows today that I'm really happy we did that. So thank you again.
I don't know if you can see this.
Bretton Woods. Yeah.
Yeah. This has a lot of the communications between White and others on developments. This is I only came across this book a year or two ago. So
can you send a list of good quality books like that I'll put in the description box so people can buy these and research them firsthand?
I'll send you 3 books. I'll send you 4, but you know some of them already.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you, Larry. And I'm going to put your link to your website in the description box.
Yeah, when you get the link fixed up and take out that interruption, I'll probably circulate it all over.
Oh, yeah, I'll get rid of the hiccup. Okay.
Yeah, good. I had several hundred people on Twitter interested, so we'll see what happens. All
right, yeah, give me some feedback on that. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Oh, and next week, Cynthia Chung, C.S. Lewis.
Oh, really?
That Hideous Strength and more.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks, Larry.
My due.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Larry. Excellent production.
Have a good day.